The price of control. A Seattle skyline betrayal. The rain was a silver curtain descending upon the Seattle skyline. But inside Ethan Vance's penthouse, the atmosphere was far colder than the storm outside. Everything in his life was meticulously curated. The floor-to-ceiling glass, the minimalist art, the 9-figure bank balance. Yet, in that sterile, high-altitude sanctuary, Clara Monroe stood shaking, holding the fragile truth that threatened to shatter his perfect world. She didn't need the thunder that ripped through the clouds to know the danger she faced. It was mirrored in the cold, blue steel of Ethan's eyes. Her voice, when she finally uttered the words, was barely a whisper. "I'm pregnant." For a long moment, the only sound was the incessant drumming of rain. Then, the laughter came. Low, bitter, and utterly devoid of kindness. "You can't be serious," he said, his face hardening as he stood, casting a terrifying shadow over her. His words, delivered with the mechanical precision of a boardroom verdict, sliced through the air, killing any lingering hope. "I told you before, I want a child, but not with you. You were a distraction, Clara. You need to take care of it now." In that single, brutal sentence, the billionaire magnate had issued a fatal ultimatum. He chose his empire over the very life they created. But what Ethan Vance failed to realize was that some destinies, once set in motion, cannot be bought, silenced, or simply walked away from. The past he tried to bury would return 2 years later, not as a woman seeking revenge, but as a small child with his exact, unforgettable eyes. The city lights sparkled through the rain that night, streaking across the windows of Ethan Vance's penthouse like molten gold. Inside, the air was thick with the tension that precedes a break. Clara Monroe stood in the middle of the living room, her hands trembling, her heart pounding so loud she could barely hear her own thoughts. She had rehearsed this conversation 100 times, had imagined it going so many ways, but nothing prepared her for the icy glare in his eyes when she finally spoke. "I'm pregnant," Clara said softly, her voice catching. The words hung in the air, fragile and shaky, like glass about to shatter. For a moment, he didn't move. He just stared at her, his expression unreadable. The silence stretched until it became unbearable. Then, slowly, he stood up, his tall figure casting a shadow over her. "You're what?" he said, his tone low and controlled. But beneath it, she could hear the danger. "Pregnant. I'm having a baby," she whispered again, clasping her hands to stop them from shaking. She thought that maybe, just maybe, he would move towards her. Maybe he'd smile. Maybe he would touch her cheek as he used to, and say everything would be okay. But instead, he laughed. Not kindly, but bitterly, as if her words had insulted him. "You can't be serious," he said. "Clara, do you have any idea what you're saying? What this means?" She tried to meet his gaze, but his eyes were cold steel. "It means we're having a child, Ethan," she said, her voice shaky but just firm enough to hold itself together. "Our child." He spun around sharply, running a hand through his hair. "No," he muttered. "Not ours. I can't do this. I won't." She felt her throat close up. "What are you saying?" she whispered. He turned back to face her, his face hard, all trace of tenderness gone. "I told you before," he said, every word a knife. "I want a child, but not with you." The word cut right through her, stealing her breath. For a second, she thought she had misheard him. Her lips parted, but no sound came out. He continued, his voice now colder. "You were a distraction, Clara. That's all. I can't let this ruin everything I've built. My life, my company, my future. I'm not throwing it all away because you made a mistake." "A mistake?" she repeated, the word barely audible. "That's what you think this is?" Her chest felt tight, her world collapsing in slow motion. He looked away, his jaw tight, unwilling to meet her eyes. "You need to take care of it," he finally said, his voice distant. "You can't keep it. I'll make sure you're compensated. But this," he gesticulated between them, "this ends now." She stared at him, disbelief turning into horror. "You can't be serious," she said, stepping closer, her voice trembling. "Ethan, please, this is our baby." He flinched as if the word burned him. "Don't call it that," he snapped. "I am not doing this." His anger filled the room like thunder. Clara felt something inside her shatter. The man she had loved, the man she had believed capable of kindness, of warmth, was gone. In his place was someone she didn't recognize, someone who looked at her as if she were nothing more than an inconvenience. Tears blurred her vision, but she refused to let them fall. She wouldn't let him see her crumble. "I thought I knew you," she whispered. "I thought you loved me." He didn't answer. He simply walked toward the door, his movements abrupt, mechanical, as if he couldn't get away from her fast enough. "Don't do this, Ethan," she said, her voice breaking. "Don't make me hate you." He stopped, his hand on the doorknob, but didn't turn around. "Then hate me," he said quietly. "It will make it easier for both of us." The door closed behind him, and the sound echoed like a gunshot. She stayed there for a long time, unable to move, unable to breathe. The apartment suddenly felt huge, the silence heavy, suffocating. The rain outside grew louder, hitting the glass as if wanting to get in. She sank to the floor, clutching her stomach, whispering through her tears, "It's okay, I'm here. Here. I won't let you go." It wasn't just a promise to the baby. It was a vow to herself. Hours passed before she finally gathered the strength to get up. She packed her things slowly, methodically, as if moving carefully could keep her together. The city outside glowed with indifferent lights. The world kept turning while hers fell apart. When she finally stepped out into the rain, it was cold, instantly soaking her coat. But she didn't care. She walked without looking back, each step heavy, but firm. The taxi driver didn't ask questions when she gave him the address of a cheap motel across town. She sat in the back seat, watching the neon reflections on the wet pavement, her thoughts blurred. When she reached the small, dimly lit room, exhaustion had consumed her. She dropped her bag on the floor and lay on the bed, one hand resting protectively over her stomach. For the first time that night, she allowed herself to cry, silently, helplessly, until she had no more tears left. When sleep finally claimed her, it was restless and shallow, but somewhere in the darkness, there was a small glimmer of peace. Despite everything, she was no longer alone. Inside her, life was beginning, and that life, fragile and small as it was, gave her something Ethan Vance could never take away: hope. The weeks that followed felt like living inside a fog, where each day merged into the next, and night seemed endless. Clara had never known true loneliness until then. The silence of her new apartment was almost unbearable, broken only by the hum of the refrigerator or the steady tick of an old clock she had bought at a thrift store. She would wake up each morning with pale light filtering through the thin curtains, staring at the ceiling, wondering how her life had come to this. Sometimes she imagined she would wake up and realize it had all been a nightmare, that she would hear Ethan's voice calling her from the kitchen, his laugh filling the room as it used to. But when she reached out, her hand only met the empty space beside her, and the reality pressed down on her like a weight she couldn't escape. She worked as much as she could to keep busy. The small clinic she had found in a rundown part of Seattle was not glamorous, but it was steady work, and it kept her from falling apart. Her co-workers didn't ask questions about her past, which was a grace she hadn't expected. She wore loose sweaters to hide the growing curve of her stomach, unsure if she was ready to tell anyone yet. There was a certain quiet dignity in keeping her secret, as if she were holding a piece of her old life close to her heart. Away from the world's judgment, the simple pregnancy was not easy. The exhaustion was constant, and some mornings she woke up nauseous and dizzy, her body aching from lack of sleep. But every time she heard her baby's heartbeat during checkups, a steady, miraculous rhythm, it reminded her that there was still something good within her life. It was as if that sound stitched her back together every time she thought she might unravel. She sometimes spoke to the baby in a low voice, almost like a prayer. "You're stronger than me," she would whisper with a small, shaky smile. "Tendrás que serlo." You'll have to be. The nights were the hardest. That's when the memories came back, sharp and unforgiving. She remembered the way Ethan's hands used to fit with hers, the warmth in his voice before it turned cold, the promises that now felt like lies. She wondered if he ever thought about her. Did he regret it? Did he feel anything at all when he left? Every time she tried to hate him, she found herself failing. Anger would rise in her chest like fire, but it always burned out into sadness. She knew she had to let him go. But letting go of the person who was once your entire world wasn't something that happened overnight. It was something you did, bit by painful bit. For her 5th month, her belly had rounded enough that hiding it was impossible. She told her boss at the clinic, expecting judgment or pity, but instead, he simply nodded and told her to take care of herself. That small act of kindness almost made her cry. The other nurses began bringing her small gifts, a thermos for tea, a pair of warm socks, a box of chocolates. It was then that she realized not all people walked away when life became complicated. It wasn't love, but it was something close to hope. One evening, after a particularly long day, she found herself sitting on a park bench overlooking the water. The air was cold and damp, and the city lights twinkled on the surface like scattered stars. She placed a hand on her stomach and watched the reflections ripple. "Do you think he'll ever know about you?" she whispered. "Would he even care?" The baby kicked softly in response, as if answering her, and she laughed quietly through her tears. "It doesn't matter," she finally said. "You have me. That's enough." And for the first time, she truly believed it. The months passed at a slow pace, and with each one, she grew stronger. She saved money, moved into a slightly better apartment, and learned to live for herself again. There were now moments of peace, small, fleeting, but real. She started feeling proud of her resilience, proud of surviving something that almost destroyed her. Then came the night she went into labor. It was early spring, and rain beat against the windows as the contractions began. Fear hit her first, a raw, paralyzing fear that she wouldn't make it, that she couldn't do this alone. But then came the thought, clear and firm. She had already done everything alone. She could do this too. She took a taxi to the hospital, clutching her small bag, breathing through the pain as the city flashed by in streaks of wet neon. The nurses were kind, their voices calm and reassuring, but the room still felt too big, too empty, without someone waiting by her side. The pain became unbearable, the waves crashing through her body. But somewhere beneath it all, she found a strength she didn't know she had. Hours later, when the cries finally filled the room, she sobbed silently with relief. The doctor placed a small bundle in her arms, and Clara looked down at her daughter, barely able to breathe. The baby's skin was soft and pink. Her tiny fingers curled instinctively around Clara's thumb. But it was the eyes that disarmed her. Deep, inquisitive gray eyes, so painfully familiar. "Hello," she whispered, wiping a tear from her cheek. "I'm your mom." The baby blinked slowly. Her mouth opened in a tiny yawn, and Clara felt something shift inside her. All the pain, the heartbreak, the loneliness, it was still there. But now it had meaning. It had led her here, to this moment, to this girl. She pressed her lips against the baby's forehead and closed her eyes. "You are my whole world now," she murmured, "and I promise I will never let anyone hurt you the way he hurt me." When morning came, the storm had passed, and pale sunlight filtered through the window. The world outside looked new, washed clean. Clara sat up in bed, the baby asleep against her chest, and smiled for the first time in what felt like an eternity. It wasn't the bright, carefree smile she once had. It was smaller, softer, the kind of smile that came from surviving something that should have broken her. She didn't know what the future held, but as she looked at her daughter, she realized she didn't need to. For the first time, the unknown didn't scare her. It felt like possibility. The months after Anya's birth passed in a blur of sleepless nights, soft cries, and quiet resilience. Clara quickly learned that motherhood was both the most beautiful and the most difficult thing she had ever faced. The apartment was small, the bills were endless, and the loneliness sometimes pressed down so hard she thought she might suffocate. Yet every time she looked at her daughter, at those gray eyes watching her with complete trust, something inside her stabilized. Anya was tiny, fragile, and perfect. Her small fingers curled around Clara's whenever they could, and in that small touch, Clara found the strength to keep going. Even on the days when she felt she couldn't. The first few weeks were chaos. Clara was constantly exhausted. She often woke before dawn, her back aching, her arms trembling from holding Anya for hours. But even through the haze of exhaustion, there was something magical about those quiet mornings, when it was just the two of them. The city outside was still sleeping, the streets empty and gray, and she would sit by the window, rocking Anya slowly, whispering stories of a future that didn't yet exist. She told her about the ocean she wanted her to see someday, about the flowers that bloomed in spring, about kindness, courage, and love that doesn't hurt. "You'll have all that," she would whisper. "I'll make sure of it." Her days were spent working part-time at the clinic and her nights caring for Anya. She learned to balance bottles in one hand while charting medical notes with the other. She learned to smile even when she wanted to cry. The doctors she worked with respected her quiet determination, though none of them knew her story. Sometimes, when one of the older nurses saw the dark circles under her eyes, she would place a hand on her shoulder and say softly, "You're doing great, honey." Those small moments of compassion kept her going. Money was always tight. She skipped meals more often than she admitted, ensuring Anya had everything she needed. The stroller she used was second-hand. The crib, it was something she'd found online for free, and the baby clothes were donated by a kind patient who had noticed her growing belly. Yet, in that small apartment, surrounded by chipped furniture and hand-me-down blankets, Clara felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. Purpose. Every sleepless night, every tear, every ache meant something now. Her life had direction again. Sometimes, though, the past crept back. There were nights when she couldn't sleep, when she found herself staring at the ceiling, remembering his voice, his cold words. "I want a child, but not with you." They repeated in her mind like a broken record, and she felt the same sharp pain she had felt the night he kicked her out. But then Anya would stir beside her, her small hand reaching for Clara's, and all the bitterness would fade. She realized that from the cruelest moment of her life had sprung something so pure that it healed her more than time ever could. When Anya turned 6 months old, Clara took her to the park for the first time. It was early morning, the air still cool, the grass shimmering with dew. She spread a small blanket on the ground and laid Anya down, watching her daughter kick her legs happily and try to reach for the sunlight. An older woman, sitting on a nearby bench, smiled at her. "The first one?" she asked kindly. Clara nodded with a shy smile. "You're doing a marvelous job," she said, before returning to her book. That sentence, said so casually, stayed with Clara for weeks. It was the first time someone had told her she was enough. As Anya grew, she became more curious, more alive. Her laughter filled the apartment, echoing off the walls like music. She had a habit of pulling Clara's hair and babbling senseless words that somehow made perfect sense to both of them. On hard days, Clara would hold her close and breathe in the baby smell of her skin, reminding herself that everything she had endured was worth it. There was a quiet joy in the ordinary moments, feeding her, bathing her, watching her fall asleep with a tiny hand curled near her face. 2 years passed almost without her noticing. Clara had built a life around her daughter, a fragile but steady rhythm of work, home, and laughter. She had stopped thinking about Ethan, or at least she told herself she had. Occasionally, when she passed a newspaper or caught a glimpse of financial news on TV, she saw his name mentioned. Still successful, still powerful, still untouchable. She quickly looked away, her heart tightening, but no longer with love, with something closer to pity. He had everything: money, power, respect. But she had something far more precious. She had peace. She had Anya. One night, after a long day at the clinic, she sat with Anya on the sofa, reading a story. Anya's head rested against her chest, her small body warm and heavy with sleep. Clara ran her fingers through her daughter's dark curls and whispered, "You're my miracle, you know." Anya didn't answer. She was already half asleep, but she smiled, a soft, sleepy smile that made Clara's chest fill with love. After putting Anya to bed, Clara stood by the window, looking out at the city. The lights twinkled in the distance, and for the first time, she no longer felt alone. Life wasn't easy, and probably never would be, but she had found strength in places she never thought existed. She had learned that love wasn't something you begged for. It was something you built, something you gave freely without expecting anything in return. And as she stood there, her reflection faint in the glass, she realized she no longer saw the broken woman who had walked out into the rain 2 years ago. She saw someone new, someone stronger, calmer, and filled with a quiet fire. She didn't know that fate was already turning, that her world was about to collide once more with the man she had vowed never to see again. But for now, in that small apartment with her daughter sleeping peacefully in the next room, Clara allowed herself to feel content. The storm had passed, or so she thought. The morning it happened started like any other, quiet and ordinary, the kind of day that felt safe in its predictability. Clara woke before the sun was up, to the faint sound of rain hitting the window. She quietly made coffee so as not to wake Anya, who was still curled up under her small pink blanket. The apartment smelled faintly of vanilla and laundry detergent, the small comforts she had built into her life to keep it warm. She moved through her morning routine with the ease of practice, brushing her hair, packing Anya's small lunch for daycare, and softly humming to fill the silence. It was peaceful, and for once, she believed that peace might last. When she arrived at the clinic, the clouds had begun to break, leaving the city washed and glistening. She greeted the receptionist, hung her coat on the back of her office chair, and sat down to organize patient files. The soft murmur of conversation, the smell of antiseptic and coffee, the familiar rhythm of the workday. Everything felt stable. Then, just before noon, the clinic manager walked in with a tall man in a dark suit, his voice carrying that overly cheerful tone people used when they were nervous. "Everyone, this is our new investor," he said. "Mr. Vance will be working closely with us from now on." Her heart stopped. She didn't have to look up to know that name. It was one that had haunted her dreams, that had been both a wound and a warning over the past 2 years. The papers in her hands trembled as she tried to keep breathing. Slowly, against every instinct that screamed at her to run, she lifted her eyes. There he was. Vance looked almost exactly the same, yet utterly different. His dark hair was slightly longer, his face sharper, as if the years had carved more seriousness into his features. He still carried that effortless confidence, like armor, the kind that made people pay attention when he entered a room. But underneath it, there was something more now, something quieter, more tired, as if he had spent years chasing something he couldn't find. Their eyes met, and in that moment, the air seemed to leave the room. Clara's first thought was disbelief. He couldn't possibly recognize her. Not here. Not like this. She looked away quickly, her pulse hammering. But as the meeting ended and he turned to leave, his gaze lingered on her for a moment longer than it should have. She could feel it, heavy and scrutinizing, as if he was trying to place her. She prayed he wouldn't. That prayer was unanswered. Later that day, she was standing by the coffee machine, pouring a cup, when she felt a presence beside her. "Clara," a voice came, low and uncertain. Her hand froze in midair. Slowly, she turned her head. He was standing there, close enough for her to smell his cologne. Familiar. Painfully familiar. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. "It's been a while," he finally said, his tone softer than she remembered. She stared back, her expression carefully neutral. "It has," she said quietly. Her voice didn't tremble, even though her hands wanted to. He looked at her, searching for something in her face. Perhaps the girl he had once known, the one he had so easily destroyed. But that girl was gone. What stood before him now was someone stronger, firmer, someone who didn't need him anymore. He seemed to notice it too. His jaw tightened slightly. "You look different," he said, and there was something like regret in his voice. "Life does that," she replied simply, setting down her cup. She was about to walk away when he spoke again, this time with more hesitation. "Are you still working in healthcare?" "Yeah." She said. "And I love it." "That's good," he muttered, almost as if talking to himself. Then, after a pause, he added, "Listen." "No," she cut him off, her tone firm. He blinked, surprised. "Don't say anything you don't mean. You don't owe me an explanation, Ethan." For a long moment they stood in silence. She could feel the weight of his gaze. She could feel the storm of things he wanted to say, but couldn't. Finally, she turned and walked away, leaving him standing there. A man who suddenly looked smaller in his expensive suit than she had ever seen him before. That night, after work, she picked up Anya from daycare. The little girl ran toward her, her laughter bright and sweet. Clara knelt to scoop her into her arms, breathing in the soft scent of her daughter's hair. The world felt right again in that moment. "Guess what, Mommy?" Anya said, her tiny voice full of excitement. "We're making animal masks tomorrow." Clara smiled, her heart melting as it always did when Anya smiled. They walked home together, hand in hand, the city glowing golden in the sunset. But as they rounded the corner near the park, Clara gasped. Across the street, standing next to a sleek black car, was Ethan. He wasn't looking at her at first, but when Anya's laughter carried across the street, He turned and froze. For a moment, time stopped. He stared at them, his eyes wide, his expression unreadable. Anya, oblivious to the tension, waved cheerfully, her small hand swinging in the air. He didn't wave back. He was too stunned, his gaze locked on the little girl, her dark curls, her small smile, her unmistakable gray eyes. His own eyes. Clara felt the world tilt, her pulse roaring in her ears, her stomach clenching with panic. She gripped Anya's hand tighter, forcing her voice to stay calm. "Come on, sweetheart," she said softly. "Let's go home." She didn't look back as she crossed the street and hurried home, but she could feel his eyes on her until she disappeared around the corner. That night, after putting Anya to bed, Clara sat in the darkness, staring at the city's quiet glow through the window. She knew what was coming. He had seen. He knew. She didn't know if he would show up tomorrow or the day after, or if he would try to find her again. But she knew one thing for certain. Her carefully constructed world was about to change. She had spent 2 years building walls strong enough to keep him out. And now, with a single glance, he had found a way back in. She pressed her forehead against the cold glass and whispered into the night, "You are not going to take her from me." And even as she said it, her heart trembled with fear, because deep down, she wasn't entirely sure if she was ready to face the man who had destroyed her, or the part of herself that still remembered what it felt like to love him. The next morning, Clara woke up with a heavy feeling in her chest, the kind that makes it hard to breathe. She had barely slept, her mind still replaying the moment in the park when Ethan saw Anya. His expression, shock, disbelief, recognition, was burned into her memory. She had hoped their paths would never cross again, that fate had finally granted her peace. But fate, it seemed, had other plans. She stood by the window, watching the first light creep across the sky, and tried to convince herself that maybe she was wrong, that maybe he wouldn't seek them out. But deep down, she knew him too well. Ethan Vance wasn't the kind of man who walked away from something that shook him. He would come. It was only a matter of time. When she arrived at the clinic that morning, her stomach twisted with every sound, every step that echoed down the hallway. The world around her felt sharper, as if everything had suddenly been brought into focus. She greeted her co-workers with a forced smile, pretending everything was normal. But she couldn't stop checking the door every few minutes, her nerves fraying with every tick of the clock. At lunchtime, as she was about to step out of the staff room, she froze. He was standing in the hallway, waiting. He looked calmer than she expected, but there was a tightness around his mouth that delataba la tormenta interior. "Clara," he said quietly. She didn't answer. She just turned to leave. But he followed her. "Please, just 1 minute," he said. "We need to talk." She stopped and turned around, her voice steady even though her heart was hammering against her ribs. "There is nothing to talk about." "That child," he said, and his voice cracked slightly. The composure fractured just enough for her to hear the incredulity. "She's mine, isn't she?" The words hung between them, heavy and irreversible. Clara looked at him for a long moment, her throat tight. "You forfeited the right to ask that question the day you left," she finally said. His eyes darkened. A flash of guilt passed over them, but he didn't back down. "Just tell me the truth." "What would the truth change?" She snapped back, her voice shaking with contained fury. "Would it make you the man you weren't then? Would it undo what you told me?" He looked away, his jaw tight. "I made a mistake," he murmured. "I know that now." The bitterness in her laugh startled him. "A mistake? You tossed me aside like I was nothing. You told me you wanted a child, but not with me. That wasn't a mistake, Ethan. That was cruelty." The hallway was empty, except for them, the air thick with everything they had never said. For the first time, He didn't have a comeback. He stood there, silent, hands in his pockets, looking like a man who had just realized he was standing in the ruins of his own creation. After a long moment, she turned to leave, but his voice stopped her. "I want to see her," he said softly. Clara froze. "No," she said immediately. "Absolutely not. You can't keep her from me," he said, stepping closer. "She's my daughter." She spun around, anger flashing in her eyes. "You don't have the right to call her that. You don't know her. You weren't there when she was born, when she cried through the nights, when I couldn't afford diapers and still made it work. You don't have the right to claim her just because you suddenly decided you care." He flinched at her words. She saw something crack behind his composed expression. Shame. Regret. Maybe even heartbreak. But she refused to soften. "Clara, please." His tone was quieter now, desperate. "I just want to make things right." She shook her head slowly. "You can't fix what you destroyed. I won't let you hurt her the way you hurt me." She walked away before he could answer, her pulse hammering in her ears. When she got home that night, she was so exhausted she could barely think. But when she opened the door and saw Anya sitting on the floor, surrounded by crayons and paper, smiling up at her with pure joy, all the fear dissolved into something else. Determination. She knelt beside her daughter and wrapped her in her arms, hugging her tight. "Mommy missed you today," she whispered, breathing in the comforting scent of baby shampoo and crayons. Anya laughed and hugged her back, oblivious to the storm brewing on the horizon. For the next few days, Clara tried to return to normal, but normal no longer existed. Ethan began to show up near the clinic, sometimes under the guise of reviewing the investment, other times waiting outside, as if he expected her to stop and talk. She never did. She avoided him at every opportunity. But one evening, as she was leaving work, he was waiting by her car. "I'm not leaving," he said quietly when she tried to walk past. "I can't." Something in his voice made her stop. It wasn't arrogance or control, it was desperation. He looked tired, his usual confidence stripped away. "You don't understand," she said, her voice weary. "It's not just about you anymore. I have to protect her." "And you think I would hurt her?" he asked softly. "You already did," she replied. Her tone was flat. "You just don't know it." The silence that followed was unbearable. Finally, she got into her car, but before driving away, she looked at him one last time. "If you really want to do the right thing, then leave us alone." Her voice was quiet but firm. "You made your choice a long time ago. Now let me live with mine." He didn't follow her that time, but as she drove home, she knew it wasn't over. Something in his eyes told her he wouldn't give up. And though the idea terrified her, a small, treacherous part of her heart wondered if maybe, just maybe, he had changed. That night, after putting Anya to bed, Clara sat on the sofa, looking at the photograph she had taken of Anya as a baby. Her tiny hands grasping her finger, that same determined expression she saw in the mirror every morning. She traced the outline of her daughter's face and whispered, "No one is taking you from me." But even as she said it, she couldn't shake the feeling that the past she had buried was clawing its way back, and that this time, it wouldn't let her go without a fight. The following week passed with the same relentless tension that had gripped Clara's life since Ethan's return. Every morning she woke up with the same weight pressing on her chest, a mixture of anger and fear, a reminder that the quiet world she had built for Anya and herself was cracking. She spent her days on autopilot, trying to maintain composure at work, smiling at patients, keeping a soft tone when talking to Anya. But inside, she was falling apart. She could feel Ethan's presence everywhere, his gaze, his voice, the ghost of everything she had once loved and hated about him. And the worst part was, he wasn't the same man who had kicked her out. That made everything more complicated. He had changed, or at least he seemed to have. His arrogance was muted, replaced by something quieter and more human. He no longer tried to confront her directly at work. Instead, he found small ways to show he was trying, sending donations to the daycare Anya attended, covering the clinic's medical debt for low-income families, not taking credit for any of it. She knew he was doing it for her, for them, but she refused to acknowledge it. Yet, each act chipped away at the fortress she had built within herself. One night, while walking home with Anya, the rain suddenly began to pour, a downpour that drenched them in seconds. Laughing, Anya lifted her small face to the sky, letting the rain soak her hair. Clara took off her jacket and tried to shield her daughter's head when she heard a familiar voice behind her. "Get in," Ethan said, holding the car door open. She froze. The sound of his voice was both comforting and terrifying. He was standing by a black SUV, rain dripping from his hair and shoulders, but he didn't move closer. He simply waited. Clara hesitated for a long moment, torn between pride and practicality. Anya was now shivering, her small body trembling. Finally, she sighed and picked her up in her arms. "Just this once," she said quietly, heading for the car. Inside it was warm and smelled faintly of cedar and rain. Ethan drove in silence, glancing at them occasionally through the mirror. When he handed her a towel from the back seat, their fingers brushed for a fraction of a second, and she felt that electric shock she had spent years trying to forget. When he stopped in front of her apartment building, Clara immediately opened the door. "Thank you," she said curtly, ready to leave. But his voice stopped her. "Clara, wait!" She turned reluctantly. He looked at her, the rain still running down his face. "I know I can't undo what I did," he said quietly. "But please believe me when I say I regret it every day. I was a coward. I thought I was protecting myself, but I destroyed the one thing that truly mattered." She wanted to tell him it was too late, that apologies didn't change the past. But when she met his eyes, she saw something raw there, something that made her chest ache despite everything. "Ethan, stop," she said, her voice trembling slightly. "You don't have the right to do this now. You don't have the right to come back and pretend you care." "I'm not pretending," he said. "I want to be part of her life." "You think you can just show up and decide that?" she asked, her voice rising. "You weren't there when she needed you. You don't even know what she likes to eat, or how she sleeps, or how she mispronounces the word butterfly every time. You don't know her. You don't know us." He looked at her for a long moment. Then he nodded slowly, accepting her anger. "Then let me learn," he said quietly. The simplicity of his words took her by surprise. For the first time in years, he didn't sound like the man who gave orders and expected obedience. He sounded like a man asking for permission to try. She didn't answer. Instead, she took Anya in her arms. She murmured another quiet, "Thank you," and disappeared into the building. That night, Clara couldn't sleep. She kept seeing his face, hearing his words. She hated that a part of her still wanted to believe him. People didn't change that easily. Yet, the man she had seen in the car wasn't the same one who had broken her. There had been sincerity in his eyes, maybe even love. But she reminded herself of the nights she had spent alone, the tears, the fear, the humiliation of begging him not to leave her. She couldn't risk opening that door again. Over the next few weeks, however, he kept showing up, never intrusively, never demanding. Once she found a small box on her doorstep. Inside was a hand-carved wooden music box with a note that read, "For Anya," from someone who wants to know her favorite lullaby. Another time he waited outside the clinic just to walk her home when the power went out in the city. He didn't speak much. He simply walked beside her in silence, his footsteps echoing in the darkness. One evening, as the city lights reflected on the wet streets, Anya saw him waiting at the door. Her eyes lit up. "Mommy, it's the kind man from the car," she said cheerfully, waving her small hand. Clara froze. Her stomach tightened. Ethan smiled gently at Anya, crouching down to her level. "Hello, Saul," he said softly. "Do you like the music box?" Anya nodded enthusiastically, grabbing Clara's hand. "It plays the sleeping song," she said proudly. "Mommy sings it to me." His smile faltered slightly, and Clara could see the emotion behind his calm expression. That moment, Anya's innocence, his quiet awe, disarmed something within her. For the first time, she saw what it meant to him to realize what he had lost. He wasn't angry or defensive. He was broken by it. She didn't say anything. She just watched as he handed Anya a small paper boat he had folded from a napkin. "For the next rain," he said with a soft smile. Anya giggled and took it. As they walked away, Clara felt tears prick her eyes. The man she had once hated had somehow found a way back to her, not through grand gestures or promises, but through something she hadn't expected. Patience. And although she told herself it didn't matter, that she wouldn't forgive him, something inside her had already begun to shift. She hated how easily the old memories returned, the warmth of his touch, the laughter they once shared, the way he used to look at her as if she were the only person in the world. That night, after putting Anya to bed, Clara stood at the window again, looking at the rain-soaked streets. Somewhere, she knew he was thinking of them too. For the first time, she didn't feel anger. She felt something far more dangerous, a glimmer of hope. Weeks turned into months, and what started as a fragile coexistence became something constant, something whole. Ethan became a quiet, undeniable presence in their world. He didn't force his way into their lives, but he stayed on the boundaries, showing up when she least expected it. Always careful, always measured. Sometimes he'd stop by the park on Saturdays, claiming it was a coincidence he was there when Anya played on the swings. Other times, he'd send small, thoughtful things for Anya. A new book about animals, a puzzle shaped like stars, crayons in her favorite colors. He never overstepped, and perhaps that was what made it hardest for Clara to keep her walls up. His patience disarmed her more effectively than his power ever could. Anya adored him without understanding who he really was. She called him the kind man, and her innocent joy whenever she saw him made it almost impossible for Clara to keep them apart. One afternoon, as she sat on a park bench watching Anya chase butterflies, Ethan sat down beside Clara. A comfortable silence settled between them. "She's amazing," he said quietly, his voice carrying a sense of reverence, as if he was afraid to break the spell of watching his daughter play. Clara's heart ached hearing it. "She is," she said softly, without looking at him. "She's everything." For a moment he didn't reply. Then he said, "You did all this alone." His words weren't a question, but a statement filled with awe and regret. She finally turned to him, her expression unreadable. "I didn't have a choice," she said simply. "You took care of that." He nodded slowly, the admission cutting him. "I know," he said. "I was a fool. I thought I could control everything in my life, but I couldn't even understand the one person who truly cared about me." His honesty took her by surprise. It wasn't the rehearsed charm she was used to hearing. This was raw, undefended. She didn't know how to respond, so she said nothing. Over the next few weeks, his presence became a fragile truce between them. He began spending short moments with Anya, with Clara always close by, watching carefully. Once they went to the zoo, a spontaneous trip Anya couldn't stop talking about for days. Clara hadn't planned on letting it happen, but when Ethan showed up at the park that morning with the tickets in his hand, and Anya's face lit up with pure excitement, she couldn't bring herself to say no. Watching them together was both beautiful and painful. Ethan carried Anya on his shoulders, pointing out giraffes and penguins, his laughter genuine and warm. It was a side of him Clara had never seen before, the powerful, distant CEO reduced to a man making silly animal noises just to hear a little girl laugh. That night, after putting Anya to bed, Clara sat on the balcony with a cup of tea, her thoughts tangled. She could no longer deny the truth. He was changing, not with words, but with actions. And that scared her more than his anger ever had. Because if he truly had changed, if the man who once broke her heart was now capable of loving, then she would have to face something she had spent years avoiding, the part of her that still loved him. The next morning, she found an envelope slipped under her door. It wasn't his usual subtle gesture. Inside was a handwritten letter from him. It wasn't long, but every word felt deliberate. He wrote that he knew he had no right to ask for forgiveness, but he wanted to try to earn it. Not for him, but for Anya. He wrote that seeing her had forced him to face everything he had run from, his fear, his pride, his own loneliness. And then he ended it with a single line that made her chest clench painfully. You were right. Love isn't about control. It's about staying even when it terrifies you. She read the letter twice, her eyes blurred by the end. Part of her wanted to tear it up, bury it, pretend none of it mattered. But another part, the part that had always believed there was still goodness in him, wanted to believe that maybe, just maybe, it wasn't too late. Still, she wasn't ready. Forgiveness was a luxury she wasn't sure she could afford. A week later, Anya became sick. It started as a fever that worsened overnight. Clara spent the night sitting by her bed, placing a cool cloth on her forehead, whispering lullabies she barely had the energy to sing. By morning, the fever had spiked higher, and panic clenched her chest. She rushed Anya to the hospital. Her mind was a blur of fear. Hours later, she sat in the sterile waiting room, her hands trembling as she filled out forms. That's when Ethan appeared, breathless, as if he had run the whole way. "Clara," he said, his voice tight with worry. "What happened?" She was too exhausted to argue, too terrified to care how he had found out. "Fever," she said weakly. "They're running tests." His expression softened, and without asking permission, he sat down beside her. For the next few hours, he didn't leave. He brought her water. He spoke to the doctors. He held her hand when she couldn't stop shaking. And when Anya finally woke up, groggy but smiling, he was there too, standing quietly at the bedside, his eyes shining with relief. It was in that hospital room, under the harsh fluorescent lights, that something shifted irrevocably between them. Clara saw a man stripped of his pride and ego, a man whose entire world now revolved around a small girl who didn't even know she was saving him. When Anya reached out a tiny hand, murmuring, "Stay," he did. He sat by her bed, gently smoothing the hair from her forehead as she drifted back to sleep. Clara watched in silence, her heart opening in ways she hadn't expected. Later that night, after Anya was resting, Ethan walked Clara to the hallway. His voice was barely a whisper. "I know you don't trust me yet, but I need you to know I'm not going anywhere." She looked at him, exhaustion etched all over her face, and said quietly, "You said that once before, and I failed," he replied. "But this time, I'm not running. Even if you never forgive me, I will still be here." For the first time, she believed him. She didn't say it out loud, but deep down, something inside her softened. The man who had once left her in the rain had returned. Not to take, not to control, but to stay. And that, more than any apology, was what she had been waiting for. The months passed after that night in the hospital, and everything began to change in quiet, implied ways. Ethan became a constant presence, no longer lurking at the edges of their lives, but slowly becoming a part of them. He didn't force it. He earned it, piece by piece, through the patience and humility Clara would never have believed him capable of. Every morning he called to ask how Anya was feeling, and every weekend he asked if he could see her. Sometimes Clara said yes, sometimes no, but he never pressed. When he did come, he spent hours on the floor building block towers, letting Anya knock them down and laughing when she shrieked with delight. There was a gentleness about him now, one that made it harder for Clara to hold on to her anger. She had built her life around the pain he caused, and now that pain was slowly unraveling into something she wasn't quite sure how to name. One afternoon, he came to the park where Clara and Anya were feeding the ducks by the pond. The air was crisp, the sky soft with early spring light. He brought coffee for Clara and a paper bag of small breadcrumbs for Anya. "You didn't have to," Clara said, though she accepted the cup. "I know," he replied, smiling faintly, "but I wanted to." It was such a simple exchange, yet something about it felt monumental. For years, his words had been weapons, filled with bitterness and regret. Now they were careful, kind, almost sweet. Anya ran ahead to throw bread into the water, and Ethan turned back to Clara. "I've been thinking," he said, his voice low. "About what?" she asked cautiously. He hesitated, his gaze following his daughter. "How lucky I am that you didn't listen to me that night," he said quietly. "If you had, I would never have known her, never have understood what love really is." Clara looked at him then, truly looked, and she didn't see the arrogant man who had kicked her out, but someone stripped bare by life, guilt, and love. "You were cruel," she said softly. Her words were not angry, but honest. "I know I shattered you," he said, his voice raw, "and I'll spend the rest of my life trying to make it right." She didn't respond, but her silence was no longer cutting. It was thoughtful, uncertain, but no longer closed off. When the sun began to set, Anya came running back, her cheeks flushed from the wind. She held out her small hand to Ethan. "Come play," she said simply, pulling him along. He smiled, got up, and followed her onto the playground without hesitation. Clara watched them, a strange warmth blossoming in her chest. For the first time in years, she didn't see his past when she looked at him. She saw a man trying to build a future. In the following weeks, the shift became undeniable. They began to share small, simple dinners, take out meals on the floor of Clara's apartment, while Anya showed off her drawings. At first it was awkward. He tried too hard, but soon the stiffness faded. He laughed more easily, stayed longer, and learned to listen instead of talk. Clara found herself looking forward to his visits, even though she told herself she shouldn't. It wasn't forgiveness yet, but it was something close to it. One night after Anya had gone to bed, Clara stood on the balcony, while Ethan stayed inside. Clearing the dishes, the city glittered around them, the windows gleaming like stars. When he joined her, they stood in silence for a long time, listening to the hum of the night. "I still remember the last thing I said to you before I left," he said quietly. "You said you wanted a child, but not with me," she replied without hesitation. He winced. "That's the sentence that haunts me every day," he admitted. "It's what I hear every time I look at her, every time I see you. I can't change what I said, but I wish you knew how much I regret it." Clara turned to him, her eyes soft but tired. "Regret doesn't erase the pain," she said. "No," he agreed, "but maybe love can heal it." For a long moment, neither of them spoke. The air between them felt fragile, like glass that might break with the wrong word. Then, in a low voice, she said, "You hurt me so deeply that I stopped believing in love. But you are the reason I learned what real love is. Because when you left, I had to give everything to her." He looked at her, his expression filled with pain and admiration. "Then maybe," he said softly, "you can teach me to love that way." Something inside her broke then, not from pain, but from release. Years of bitterness melted away, leaving only exhaustion and a strange, aching peace. She didn't say yes. She didn't forgive him. Not yet, but she didn't push him away either. They stood there in the quiet, their shoulders slightly touching, both looking out at the city, which had once swallowed their history and was now a silent witness to their rebirth. Weeks turned into months, and what began as a fragile coexistence became something steady, something whole. Ethan became a part of their daily lives, not as the man who had abandoned them, but as a father who was learning, slowly, to love unconditionally. He picked Anya up from daycare, learned how to braid her hair badly, and stayed up late helping her build block castles that never stood straight, but always made her laugh. Clara sometimes watched them from across the room, her heart full and terrified all at once. One evening, as they walked home together, with Anya clutching both their hands, she looked up and said innocently, "Mommy, do you love the kind man? Do you love—" The question hit Clara like a gust of wind, stopping her in her tracks. Ethan froze too, his gaze locked on her. For a moment, she didn't know how to answer. Then she knelt down, brushing a lock of hair from Anya's face. "I love both of you very much," he said softly. It wasn't a lie. It wasn't a promise either. But it was real. Later that night, after Anya was asleep, Ethan stood by the door, ready to leave. "She's happy," he said quietly. "You've given her everything." Clara smiled faintly. "We've given her everything," she corrected him. His eyes flickered with emotion. "Do you think there's a chance?" he asked slowly. "For us to start over, not from where we were, but from who we are, Hannah." She looked at him for a long moment, her heart heavy with everything they had endured. Then she nodded. "Just a chance, maybe," she said, her voice trembling. "But don't rush it. Let it grow." He smiled then, a small, genuine smile that reached his eyes. And for the first time in years, Clara wasn't afraid of him. As he left, she stood at the window, watching him walk down the quiet street until he disappeared into the night. Behind her, Anya stirred in her sleep, murmuring something soft. Clara turned and looked at her daughter. Her miracle, her proof that love could survive even the worst endings. In that moment, she understood something she hadn't understood before. Sometimes, the people who break us aren't meant to be erased. Sometimes they are meant to come back, changed, to show us that healing doesn't come from forgetting the pain, but from facing it and choosing love anyway. And as the night wrapped around the city, Clara finally allowed herself to breathe again. Not because everything was perfect, but because for the first time, she truly believed it could be.